Poor woman gives her only meal to a beggar without asking for anything in return. The next day, a Ferrari appears, and what happens next moves everyone. A poor woman gives her only meal to a beggar without asking for anything in return. The next day, a Ferrari shows up, and what happens next moves everyone. And woke before dawn, wrapped in a torn blanket, lying on a soaked piece of cardboard next to the wall of an abandoned market. The early morning cold pierced her skin and seeped into her bones, as if her body itself had given up on keeping warm. Around her were torn bags, rotting food scraps, and the bitter smell of urine. She had slept there, among trash and oblivion, because no one chased her away. It wasn't shelter, just the only place where she was still tolerated during the night. Widowed for 3 years, with no children or living relatives, and had been consumed by a relentless series of losses. First her husband, then her job, next her home, and finally, hope. She tried to hold on to what little remained, but hunger and loneliness shown no mercy. She ended up on the streets. At first, she resisted, tried to maintain dignity, pleaded with her eyes. But over time, she was forced to extend her hand, to beg for crumbs. What she received in return was brutal. People had spat in her face, laughed at her, even pushed her into the mud. It didn't happen every day, but once was enough to scar the soul, and would sit for hours in the same spot, knees bent and hands outstretched, staring into indifference. Sometimes someone dropped a coin without looking. Other times, they dodged her as if she were a plague. On the worst days, she returned to her corner penniless, her stomach clinging to her back, her eyes dry from trying to cry. It wasn't just hunger, it was the weight of being unseen, no longer considered human. Still, something inside and refused to die. Maybe it was pride. Maybe the echo of who she had been. Even living among refuse, she tried to wash her face with cold water in public bathrooms, combed her hair with her fingers, kept her back straight when walking. It was a small but firm gesture, a way to remind herself she was still human. But each day, that spark weakened. She was tired. Tired of the cold, hunger, loneliness, and most of all, of being forgotten. That morning, Anne walked to the back of a small market where she knew employees discarded nearly spoiled fruit before opening. She rummaged through the trash bag with trembling hands, searching for something still whole. She found half an apple, a stale piece of bread, and a blackened banana, which she carefully stored in a torn plastic bag. That would be her meal for the day, or maybe 2. The smell of rotting food clung to her skin, but she barely noticed any more. Her body had learned to survive with less. Less food, less warmth, less rest. Hunger was a constant presence, but it had become a muted, continuous ache, like background music that never stopped. Her eyes no longer shone. Anne's gaze was dull, distant, as if she were always watching the world from behind an invisible wall. She knew she was alive, but wasn't sure if that still meant anything. On the sidewalks, she saw clean shop windows and families preparing for work or school. She felt like a ghost moving among the living. She passed smiling faces, expensive perfumes, fresh coffee cups. Sometimes someone swerved sharply to avoid her, as if her presence were a threat. In those moments, Anne clenched her fists inside her coat sleeves and kept walking firmly. She no longer cried in public. She had learned that street tears move no one. She found a bench in the park and sat down, shielding her bag of fruit with her body. The sun began to rise between the buildings, but did little to warm her skin. She was tired. Not just physically, it was soul-deep weariness, a weight no amount of sleep could relieve. And watched people rushing past, and thought of when she too had rushed, dreamed, planned. Now she didn't plan. She just hoped the day would end, and that the next, by some miracle, would be slightly less cruel. Later, and returned to the place where she used to live. It was a ritual she repeated from time to time, like visiting a sacred place. She slowly passed by the sidewalk in front of the old building, looking at the second-floor windows where she had been happy for so long. She recognized the plant pots on the balcony, new tenants surely, but the apartment still carried the memory of her and her husband. That was where they had Sunday morning coffee, where they cried together, where they laughed without fear. She stopped across the street and stood still for a few minutes, trying to feel something that would reconnect her to that time. But there was no warmth left, only the cold memory of everything she had lost. Time didn't erase the images, it just pushed them further away, like an old movie she no longer had the strength to rewind. The past felt like a dream lived by someone else. And maybe it was. The woman who lived there wasn't the same as the one now walking barefoot, feet wounded, soul in silence. As she moved away from the building, she felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted to go back in time, even for a moment, to feel her husband's hands or smell the coffee he used to make. But time offered no kindness. On the contrary, it pushed her deeper into a bottomless reality. And walked on, head down, carrying only memories and the accumulated weariness of another day. Back in the alley where she usually slept, she sat on the ground and ate a piece of the apple. She chewed slowly, as if each bite were an act of defiance. She stored the rest carefully, as if it were a precious treasure. She knew that food had to last. Tomorrow was a promise she couldn't guarantee. There, surrounded by garbage and neglect, and curled up against the wall, and hugged her knees, trying to protect herself from the world. The silence around her was so dense it seemed to press down on her shoulders. That night, the cold came early, and tried to warm herself with newspapers she had collected during the day, but the wind tore through them, as if rejecting her even from the world's crumbs. Her body ached, but she didn't move. Exhaustion had triumphed over hunger, thirst, and even fear. She no longer had the strength to wish for anything, except for the next day not to come. And yet deep down, a part of her still clung to survival, a stubborn instinct that refused to die. As she tried to sleep, jumbled thoughts invaded her mind. She remembered her husband's face the last time at the hospital, his voice saying everything would be okay. She also thought about the humiliation of begging for food, the laughter of those who despised her, the coldness of closed doors. It felt like the world owed her something, but no one would ever acknowledge it. And what hurt most was knowing her pain didn't matter to anyone. Before falling asleep, she felt a stab in her stomach and gripped the bag with the banana remains tightly. She knew the next day wouldn't bring miracles, but even so, she would face it. As she always did. Tomorrow, she would return to the streets. Try a new spot. Repeat the same old struggle. To be seen. To survive. It was all she could do. And, deep down, it was all she had left. The night wore on, and the city slept. And, curled between boxes and bags, seemed part of the scenery, invisible to the world's eyes. But there, on that forgotten corner, there was a woman who still breathed, who still remembered, who still felt. And though she had lost almost everything, something inside her remained lit, faint but lit. A dim flame, waiting for someone to blow it back to life. The sun hadn't yet touched the horizon when and rose from the hard, cold ground of the alley. Her muscles ached, her bones felt fragile, and her curved spine seemed to plead for rest. But she stood up, as she did every day, not driven by hope, but by the brutal necessity of continuing to exist. She put on her dirty coat with slow movements and adjusted her hair with her hands, trying to look less worn than she felt. Outside, the day promised to start like all the others, indifferent. With slow steps, she headed toward the city center. At that hour, there wasn't much movement yet, and the silence of the empty streets brought a brief illusion of peace. And knew the best places to seek help, or at least something resembling breakfast. She followed her survival routes precisely. Bakeries that sometimes left leftovers, markets with accessible dumpsters, restaurants with kind-hearted cooks. It was like hunting for crumbs amid concrete buildings. Along the way, she avoided puddles, ignored sideways glances from early commuters, and shielded herself from the light drizzle beginning to fall. A wet city felt even more cruel. Slippery sidewalks, the intensified smell of trash, people in a hurry to avoid any contact. And knew that with the rain, her chances of getting anything dropped even more. No one stopped to help someone soaked and invisible. It was as if the rain washed away even the little compassion left in the streets. The pain in her stomach returned like a slowly turning knife. She hadn't eaten anything solid in nearly a day. Yesterday's apple had been the last decent thing. She hugged her arms against her body, trying to warm herself and suppress the hunger at the same time. She had no destination, just kept walking, step after step, like a body pushed by an invisible force. A body in motion. A name that still refused to disappear completely. And reached the entrance of a busy bakery. The smell of fresh bread, coffee, and melted butter hit her like a blow, sharpening her hunger even more. She leaned against the wall beside the door, trying to seem discreet. She watched people enter and leave with full bags, laughing, chatting on phones, immersed in lives so different from hers they seemed from another planet. She no longer begged with words, she just waited, head lowered, hoping someone would notice her presence. Minutes passed. Most people pretended not to see her. Some deliberately avoided her. Others quickened their pace. Finally, an elderly woman placed a day-old bread on the low wall beside Anne. That was all. A silent, swift, almost embarrassed gesture. Anne picked up the bread carefully and whispered a thank you that no one heard. She sat on the curb, shielding herself from the light rain under an awning, and bit into the bread slowly, as if it were a rare gift. With her stomach slightly soothed, Anne got up and kept walking. Her feet ached in the soaked shoes. The sole of one was torn, and cold water seeped into the insole with every step. It was hard to keep her head high. The physical exhaustion combined with the constant humiliation of being treated like a nuisance. With every averted gaze, a little more of her faded. Still, she kept going, not knowing exactly where to, just following the impulse to stay alive. Passing by a church, and paused for a few moments. She observed the lit interior, the candles burning, a few people sitting silently. She didn't go in. She felt that place was no longer meant for her. She hadn't prayed in a long time, not from a lack of faith, but from exhaustion. Her prayers seemed to reach nowhere. Still, she stayed there for a few minutes, watching, listening to the silence inside. Then she moved on. The city was calling. Hunger, cold, and loneliness didn't wait for miracles. Back in the alley, she called home, and noticed someone had tampered with her few belongings. The blanket was out of place, the cardboard wet and torn. She felt a jolt of anger and fear. On the street, everything has to be defended. Even things that seem worthless. That was hers. It was what remained. She looked around, but no one was nearby. No familiar faces. No explanation. Only the wind carrying empty plastic bags down the sidewalk. She reorganized everything with slow hands, placing the blanket in the driest corner, adjusting the bag with her few items, a photo of her husband, an old rent receipt, the piece of soap she used to wash discreetly. That was all that remained of the woman she once was. That was everything. When she finished, she sat down and leaned against the wall, exhausted. She felt like the world was pushing her out of everything, out of a sidewalk, the city, her own existence. Night began to fall. The sky turned gray, and building lights started to come on. And watched the illuminated windows and imagined what was happening inside. People dining, children doing homework, couples arguing over trivialities. She on the outside was just a shadow. No one cared what she ate, where she slept, or what she dreamed of. Perhaps they didn't even remember she existed. She lay down early, trying to make the most of the little warmth still left in her body. She made a pillow out of the bag and hugged the blanket tightly. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She was more concerned with the safety of the place than with hunger. The night was always a risk. Drunks, cruel teenagers, people who liked to beat those already on the ground. She closed her eyes, trying not to think about anything. She just needed to survive one more night. Just one more. The next day dawned with a weak sun and humidity in the air. And got up slowly, her body aching as if she had been beaten. She walked to a hidden tap behind a parking lot and washed her face, feeling the cold water sting her skin. Her clothes, still damp from the night before, clung to her body. She wanted to change shirts, but had no other. She carried only what she could, and even that was too heavy. She decided to walk to an open market. There perhaps someone would drop a fruit, or a vendor would take pity and give her leftovers. On the way, she passed many people, but none noticed her. It was as if she were part of the sidewalk, as if her existence were just city noise. She was used to it by now, but each time still hurt, like a wound that never fully healed. At the market, she scanned the stalls with her eyes low, trying to seem less desperate than she felt. A young woman gave her a bruised tomato. It was enough to make her thank silently with a slight nod. Later, she found a piece of bread near a dismantled stand. She put both in her bag. It wasn't much, but it was food. And at that point in life, that was already a victory. With the sun high and her body tired, and returned to her spot. She sat on the ground, divided the bread and tomato into small portions, and ate slowly. The hunger pain eased a bit, but the emptiness remained untouched. She looked at the cloudy sky and sighed. She didn't know that her life would change forever the next day. At that moment, all she knew was that she had survived another day. And sometimes that already felt like a miracle. And walked slowly among the rubble of a vacant lot behind an old abandoned building. She was looking for a new place to spend the night, since her usual alley had become too dangerous. She had eaten little that morning, and weakness made her legs tremble. The sun had not yet broken through the cloudy sky, and the silence of the streets felt heavier than usual. That's when she heard a muffled sound from the ground, something between a sigh and a call for help. She approached cautiously until she noticed a crater in the ground, hidden under leaves and rotten wood. Inside, a man lay collapsed. His face was dirty, his hair long and tangled, and his eyes half closed from exhaustion. He tried to climb up the slippery walls, but the mud caused him to fall again. His arms trembled. His breathing was shallow. And looked around, no one. No movement. No sound. Just her, and that man buried in the earth. Without hesitation, she grabbed an old plank she found among construction debris and carefully pushed it down into the hole, creating an improvised ramp. She extended her hand, steady, and waited. The man looked up with effort, then slowly began to climb. He slipped twice, and didn't retreat. When he reached the edge, she pulled his arm with strength, ignoring the pain in her shoulders. Both of them collapsed on the ground, gasping. His body was too light, as if hunger had consumed more than just flesh. Without thinking, Anne opened her bag. She took out the piece of bread and the leftover tomato. It was all she had for the rest of the day. She observed the man for a moment. He could barely sit upright, his face pale, his eyes downcast. Then she handed him the food. All of it. She didn't break it, didn't keep any for herself. She simply gave it. The man took it slowly, surprised, confused, and stepped back in silence and sat in a corner. Her stomach screamed, but she did not retreat. She wasn't seeking compassion, nor did she expect anything. She simply couldn't bear to see someone even more sunken than herself. The man took a while to eat. He held the bread with trembling hands, as if afraid it would vanish. The tomato slipped through his fingers, but he brought it to his mouth with care, chewing slowly, and watched from afar, sitting between two concrete blocks. She expected no thanks. That wasn't a heroic gesture, nor a hope for reward. It was simply an impulse, perhaps the last remnant of humanity she still had. And for some reason, in that moment, she didn't regret it. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the street. It was a different kind of absence, as if both understood, without words, that there was nothing left to explain, and saw the man's shoulders gradually relax, as if the food had not only fed his body, but also returned a forgotten part of himself. She didn't know his name or his story, but by the way he looked at her, eyes full and restrained, she sensed that something was happening beyond physical need. The wind began to blow stronger, scattering dry leaves around them, and pulled her thin coat tight against her chest, trying to keep what little warmth she had. The man, still leaning against the wall, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He was exhausted, but there was something different in his posture, a subtle firmness, almost imperceptible. As if, in that small gesture of compassion, something inside him had been reactivated, an invisible thread pulling him back to the surface of life. They stayed there for a time, and couldn't measure. Minutes or hours. It didn't matter. The world around them kept turning, indifferent, but in that filthy, forgotten corner of the city, two bodies sat side by side, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. When she finally stood to leave, the man lifted his eyes and watched her go without saying a word. And in that look, there was something that made her hesitate for just a moment, a presence that would remain with her long after she walked away, and continued walking in silence through the empty streets. Her body felt heavy, but something inside her felt different, not exactly lighter, but changed. There was a kind of calm that didn't come from resignation, but from having done something that wasn't about her own survival. The act of giving away her only food hadn't been planned, nor thought through. But now, even as her empty stomach protested, she felt no regret. For the first time in a long while, she felt she had done something right. The sun was already setting, tinting the buildings with golden hues and casting long shadows, and walked slowly, returning to the alley she called home. Her steps were the same as every day, but her mind remained fixed on the image of that man trapped in a hole, on the way he had looked at her after eating. It wasn't gratitude in his eyes. It was something else, as if he recognized her from somewhere deeper than words could reach. That unsettled her, but also warmed her. Back in her spot, she arranged her cardboard and lay down. The thin blanket barely shielded her from the cold night that approached. But unlike other days, she didn't close her eyes right away. She lay there, looking at the dark sky appearing between rooftops and power lines. She thought of the man she had left behind. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why was he in that hole? None of it made sense, but for the first time, she cared. And that alone felt like a luxury far too rare for someone like her. The hunger, which always followed her into sleep, didn't ache the same way that night. It was still there, of course. But something else lay over it, a layer of meaning, of gesture, of memory. And didn't know what the next day would bring, nor if she would ever see that man again. But a part of her, fragile and disbelieving, wished she would. Not for what he could offer, but for what he had already done without knowing it. Reminded her that even forgotten by the world, she could still change someone else's day. The next day dawned gray, with a damp wind dragging leaves through the streets, and woke up with her face covered in dust and aching shoulders. She got up slowly, weaker than the previous days. The little she had eaten wasn't enough, but she was already used to treating her body like a broken machine, pushing it forward with effort, hoping it could last a little longer. She gathered her things and began walking, with no set destination. Turning a corner that led to the lot where she had been the day before, she stopped. Sitting in the same spot where she had left the man, he was there. He was cleaning his hands with a dirty rag, fixing his hair, as best he could, and looked more alert. When he saw her, he straightened up, and felt a tightness in her chest, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. She hadn't expected to see him there, much less still waiting. The man stood up with effort and gestured toward a space beside him, as if saying he had saved the spot, and approached in silence and sat down next to him. The ground was still wet, but she didn't mind. They didn't exchange words, nor exaggerated gestures. They just sat there, sharing the same space, the same silence, as if that were already a kind of agreement. An unspoken pact between two strangers who had saved each other, even without fully understanding how. The city continued its rhythm around them, honking horns, hurried footsteps, distant shouts. But in that small, forgotten corner, time seemed suspended. And glanced sideways at the man. There was something different in his eyes now. Less fatigue, more presence. As if he, too, were returning from some dark place. And for the first time in years, she felt she wasn't completely alone. For the first time in years, someone would be there the next day. And return to the vacant lot the next morning, without having planned it. Something inside her, quiet and wordless, guided her steps back to that place. She found the man sitting where he had been the day before, leaning against a pile of concrete blocks, staring into the void with the expression of someone who has seen too much. When she approached, he just looked at her for a few seconds and slightly nodded, like someone recognizing a familiar face. They sat side by side, without words, as if it were the most natural thing to do. He didn't pretend to be someone he wasn't, and that comforted her. There was no need for made-up stories, no empty promises. He simply existed there with her in silence, and noticed in his gestures a kind of restraint different from other homeless people. There was no revolt or haste in his movements, just a kind of acceptance, and that made her trust him. He never asked who she had been, and she never asked about his past either. What existed between them didn't need a past to be real. During the hours they spent together, she sometimes talked about small memories. She recalled childhood scents, the sounds of her old home, or the taste of the orange cake made on Sundays. He listened with genuine attention, slightly tilting his head, keeping his eyes fixed on her. That gesture alone was enough. There was respect in that silence, a rare kind of listening that required no explanations. For the first time in a long while, and didn't just feel tolerated, she felt welcomed. When the day ended, they stood almost at the same time. She lightly touched his shoulder before leaving, a brief, instinctive gesture, but full of meaning. He didn't reply with words but stood still, watching her until she disappeared among the shadows of the rubble, and walked back to her spot feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, the certainty that someone would wait for her the next day. And that, to her, was already a silent miracle. The next morning, and found an apple on the crate where she usually sat. It wasn't perfect, but it was red, whole, and clean. She looked around in surprise until she saw him emerge from the debris of the lot, walking slowly and steadily. He didn't point to it, didn't explain. He just approached and sat beside her, as if the gesture spoke for itself, and held the apple delicately and ate it slowly, taking in not only the nourishment but also the care behind it. That gesture touched something deep in, and it wasn't just food, it was recognition. It was proof that, even without words, someone saw her. He didn't use appearances to deceive, nor did he pretend to be miserable like her. But he also didn't explain himself. His silence was honest. He never offered stories. He just brought sometimes a fruit, a piece of bread, a bottle of clean water. He always handed them over naturally, as if it were part of an old routine. In the days that followed, that routine continued. and grew used to his presence and the discreet care he offered. There was dignity in his small acts, the way he placed items on the ground instead of handing them directly, the way he listened without judgment, and didn't need answers. She sensed there was pain in his past, as in hers, and that was enough to establish a trust that blossomed without effort, like watering something already planted. Over time, sharing silence became comforting. It was no longer absence, it was presence, and realized that gestures said everything. When he left space on the crate, when he waited for her at dusk, when he shared what little he had. Nothing needed to be said. And maybe precisely because of that, it was all more real. It was the first bond that required nothing but staying, and arrived at the lot weaker than usual. Her body ached, fever blurred her vision, and the exhaustion felt larger than the world. She sat slowly in her usual spot, shoulders hunched beneath a thin blanket. She had no strength to maintain posture or pretend resilience. When he arrived, his eyes went straight to her face. Without asking anything, he knelt beside her, examining her condition calmly and attentively. From a bag, he pulled out a thermos and poured a hot liquid into a metal cup. He handed it to Anne with a restrained gesture. She held it with both hands, as if holding a treasure. The warmth of the steam made her shiver. She drank slowly, feeling the heat run down her throat and warm her insides. The flavor was simple, but the gesture was beyond measure. There was no pity, only presence, and that was what made the difference. He also brought a thicker blanket and carefully placed it over her shoulders, and closed her eyes, overcome by her body and by trust. She slept there, head resting on a bag of old clothes, while he remained at her side, motionless. He didn't touch her, didn't watch her, he was just there, a fixed point amid chaos. When she awoke, the sun was already setting, and he was still present, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something only he understood, and didn't say anything when she stood up. She just crossed eyes with his for a brief moment. There was something in that look that gave her back a fragment of security. She felt she was no longer alone, and that, for someone like her, meant more than any promise. It was the feeling that, even sick and forgotten, someone was still willing to stay. Over time, their coexistence became part of the days, and no longer found his presence strange. It was as if the abandoned lot, once a symbol of neglect, had gained a new purpose. Now it was a place where two survivors found some kind of solace. One afternoon, he brought 2 cans of preserved food and a metal opener. They sat on the damp ground, opened the cans carefully, and ate with the slowness of those who savor something sacred. That afternoon, and learned his name. He drew it on the ground with a dirt-covered finger. Harry. No explanation, no grand tone. Just a name written among the cement debris. She looked at it for a few seconds, and then drew hers next to it with trembling fingers. Anne. That silent gesture sealed something stronger than an introduction. 2 names, marked on the ground in the middle of the mud. From that day on, the gestures became more intimate. He took care of small things, shielded the spot where she sat from the rain, cleared away glass shards, warmed water before handing it to her. She, in turn, organized the space, laid out dry papers to line the floor, cleaned up leftover meals. It was an improvised routine, but full of meaning. The outside world remained indifferent, but there was order inside, simple, silent, and full of truth. When the night cold returned, and sat closer to him, not out of weakness, but by choice, it was no longer just about survival, it was about companionship, about recognition. And for the first time, she felt she could trust someone. Harry owed her no explanations, and yet he was there, present, constant. And that, for someone who had been forgotten by everyone, felt like touching something many believe no longer exists: dignity. The day dawned with a clear sky and cold air cutting through the city, and left the alley where she had slept and walked toward the vacant lot. Her steps were slow, her body tired, but inside her there was a new tranquility built over the past few days. She expected to find Harry, to sit beside him, to share the morning in that same comforting silence. It was more than routine. It was the only place in the world where she felt part of something. Upon arriving at the lot, he wasn't there. There were marks on the ground, the paper remains were organized, but he was gone. She sat in the same spot and waited. For a while, she watched birds fly between wires and dry branches. The silence felt heavier without him. Hours passed and nothing changed, and felt a strange unease, as if the air around her had shifted. A nameless premonition. She decided to walk a bit. She followed the sidewalk with short steps, turning corners as if looking for something she didn't know. Then, turning the last corner before the alley where she lived, she stopped. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Parked right in front of where she slept was a shiny red car. A Ferrari. New, gleaming, completely out of place, like a sun in the middle of darkness. It was impossible not to see it, and stood frozen for long seconds, her heart racing. The car door opened slowly, and out stepped a familiar figure. It was Harry. He wasn't dirty, nor hurt, nor tired. He wore clean clothes, stood upright. The same calm gaze, now lit by something more. He walked toward her. There was no arrogance in his gestures, only firmness. And on his face, an expression that mixed serenity and destiny. Anne's world spun in silence. Nothing made sense, and yet everything fit. Harry stood in front of Anne without hurry. The two faced each other for a moment that felt suspended in time. She didn't move, her body still frozen by the surreal scene unfolding before her. The same man she had pulled from a hole, who had shared silence with her among ruins, now appeared as someone entirely different. It wasn't just the appearance, it was the way he carried himself, steady, whole, with the look of someone who no longer needed to hide, and didn't know what she felt. It wasn't anger nor fear. It was a strange mix of disbelief and recognition, as if she had always sensed something special in him. But she had never imagined he came from a world so distant from hers. He walked over to the alley, observing the place where she had slept like someone looking at an old wound. Then he turned back to her, his eyes gentle. In his expression was respect, not pity, but admiration. That's when the truth emerged. Harry was not homeless. He was a widowed businessman who, for years, had lost everything emotionally, despite having all the money in the world. He had remained silent for a long time, withdrawing from everything, until he decided to see with his own eyes if true compassion still existed. If anyone was still capable of offering what little they had without expecting anything in return. He hadn't lied about who he was. He had simply remained quiet, letting his actions speak louder than any explanation. And listened, her heart racing. She needed no proof, no promises. What he had done in the days before had already said enough. And now, standing before her, there was no millionaire or stranger. There was someone who had seen her, heard her, and respected her in her most vulnerable form. And that silent truth bound them together with a strength no amount of wealth could explain. Harry showed her where he now lived, not with ostentation, but with transparency. It was a house on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and silence. A large place, but lonely. A beautiful space, but empty. And felt discomfort at first when stepping inside. The clean floors, the expensive furniture, the unfamiliar smells. Everything contrasted with her recent days of hunger and cold. But he didn't try to impress her. He simply showed her the space he occupied in the real world. During that visit, Anne saw framed photos on the walls for the first time. Pictures of a smiling woman, hugging Harry at parties and gardens on trips. She was his wife. She had died 3 years ago, the same time, and had lost her husband. Both carried grief. And there, in that sunlit hallway, the two recognized each other not for who they were now, but for what they had lost in the past. The weight of loneliness was a language both spoke. And although they came from different worlds, their pains walked in parallel. He had withdrawn from the world because he could no longer find meaning. She had been pushed out by a world that ignored her. But in that unexpected reunion, they discovered that absence, when shared, could become presence. And that was the strongest foundation they could build together. And didn't ask why he had chosen her. Deep down, she knew the answer didn't matter as much as what they were building now. He had seen her when no one else did. And she had heard him when he had forgotten what it was like to be heard. Their bond wasn't born of luxury, but of truth. And truth was something neither money nor misery could hide for long. In the days that followed, and began visiting Harry often, she never asked for anything, never expected anything. She kept her feet firmly on the ground, even as she walked on plush carpets. He, in turn, treated her with silent reverence, as someone who knows the value of something almost lost. And so between small gestures and shared silences, something began to grow. It wasn't instant passion. It was care, intimacy, and respect. Harry didn't try to dazzle her with promises or gifts. He simply made space. A seat at the table, a chair by the fireplace, a flower on the windowsill. And, receiving this, didn't feel intruded upon or transformed. She felt welcomed. He didn't want to change her. He wanted to walk beside her. And that, for someone who had spent years being invisible, was the rarest gesture of all, being chosen without needing to hide or change. One quiet evening, while watching the sky from the porch, Anne felt something inside her had shifted. She no longer carried the same weight on her shoulders. She still remembered every pain, every cold night, every dry tear. But those memories no longer crushed her, they only reminded her of where she came from. Harry, too, seemed more whole, as if she had rescued him just as much as he had lifted her from the ground. They were two shards that, together, no longer cut, but fit. And that quiet night, the world kept spinning, unaware that in a quiet corner of the city, two survivors had found each other. Not by accident, not by convenience, but because there was between them a truth impossible to ignore. Love is born not from what one has, but from what one gives. The days that followed were unlike anything Anne had ever known. Not because of comfort or full meals, but because of stability. She woke in a warm room with clean sheets, and for the first time in years, she didn't have to rush out to survive. Her body, once as tense as a dry branch, began to relax. Her movements slowed, her eyes steadied, and was relearning how to inhabit a world she once believed no longer belonged to her. Harry didn't pressure her. He gave her space, but also presence. Sometimes the two would spend hours just walking through the garden or sitting in silence under the afternoon light, and began to see that there was something between them growing with time, without rush. It wasn't just care, it was a bond shaped by respect, listening, and companionship. And in that bond, for the first time, she felt she could reinvent herself without erasing who she had been. In time, and began helping around the house, caring for the plants, organizing neglected spaces. It was as if she were rebuilding herself while restoring that home. Every simple gesture, washing a dish, folding a blanket, became a symbol that she now belonged, and that, more than any gift or promise, moved her most. To be useful, to be seen, to be part of something. The house also changed with her. Small details appeared, flowers in old vases, rearranged pictures, open windows, letting in light. Anne's presence didn't erase Harry's past, but gave it a new layer. Now, there were two hearts beating under the same roof, with stories that didn't cancel each other, but completed one another. Pain had been the bridge, choice the foundation. Time passed, seasons changed, and no longer feared the mirror, nor flinched at the touch of warm water. She had learned to occupy that space with the lightness of someone who had once known the bottom. And Harry watched it all with quiet admiration. He saw in her not the woman rescued, but the one who had risen on her own many times before accepting help. And that moved him deeply. On a calm, late afternoon, as they walked silently through the garden, Harry stopped beside her. There was no rush, no exaggerated emotion, but something in his gesture said it all. A simple, old ring rested in his hand. It had belonged to his late wife. And now, in that moment, he offered it to, and not as a replacement, but as a symbol of continuity, of rebuilding, of a future, and didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just looked for a long moment and held out her hand, not for vanity, nor for security, but because she knew clearly that this gesture sealed a pact built with time and truth. There was no rescue here, no charity. There was a mutual choice. Two people who had seen each other in ruins and still decided to bet on one another. The house seemed to breathe deeply that night. The porch lights stayed on until late, and the furniture, the walls, the objects witnessed a silent promise made with no party, no witnesses, but full of truth. A new cycle was born, and the world, so indifferent until then, had no idea that in that quiet corner, two souls had decided to be reborn together. The wedding was discreet. There were no fancy dresses or an excessive guest list. Just a small group of Harry's close people, longtime employees, trusted friends, quiet neighbors. Anne wore a simple dress, made of light fabric, her hair tied in an improvised bun. She walked with confidence, knowing the value of that moment. Not because of pomp, but because of restored dignity. The environment was decorated with flowers from their own garden. The ceremony took place right there, under an old tree. When the two approached each other, their eyes met with serenity. Nothing was improvised. Everything had been built day by day, gesture by gesture, since the moment she reached out to pull him from a forgotten hole. After the ceremony, they walked through the house together, like people walking into their destiny with steady steps, and looked at every corner with new eyes. She was no longer a guest, nor a visitor. She was a resident, a partner. Harry guided her with contained pride, as someone who knew he wasn't offering a home, but sharing it with someone who had enough soul to fill it. The night fell serenely, and the two sat side by side on the porch. The world outside continued with its noise and rush. But there, amid yellow lights and the scent of flowers, two hearts beat in peace. It wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. It was a fair, strong, well-deserved beginning. The redemption of someone once ignored who was now loved. The confirmation that kindness, even forgotten, always finds its way back. Months passed. The city followed its routine, the streets remained cold, and the alleys quiet. But Anne no longer walked through the leftovers of the city. Now she walked through the hallways of her home, through blooming gardens, along the paths of a new time. The old pain still lived in her, it would never fully disappear, but now it served only as a reminder of the strength that had brought her here. Harry remained by her side, not as a savior, but as a companion. The two shared life like people tending a fire in the middle of the night, knowing the value of its warmth and the care needed to keep it alive. There were no grand promises, no daily declarations. Just consistency, presence, a kind of love that doesn't shout but sustains. One morning, Anne woke up early and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was slowly rising, painting the sky with golden tones. She looked at the garden and remembered everything. The alley, the hole, the hunger, the apple left on the crate. Every detail was part of the same story. A hard story, but a true one. And now, looking at the horizon, she knew she had won. Not by luck, but by kindness, by gesture, by the choice to keep going even when the world spat in her face. And when she felt Harry approaching from behind, she didn't turn around right away. She just smiled. It was the same smile she gave the day she offered her last food. The same look. Because deep down, that woman was still the same, only now, she was finally seen by someone who deserved to see her. Give me a rating from 0 to 10 for this story in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video that's on the screen.